Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Jake Williams, SANS Senior Instructor, and Michael Morris, Director of Technology Alliances and Business Development at Endace. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to our presenters.
Hey, thank you so much, Carol. Really appreciate it. Folks, I am super excited to be here today for yet another Endace webcast. I do want to throw out first off, mad props to Endace. A year ago and change, they came to us and said, hey, we want to do some webcasts where we talk about and school people on how to do good network traffic analysis. Of course, that's what Endace does. As a matter of fact, I don't know why I'm going to explain what Endace does other than to say thank you so much for sponsoring this series of webcasts. We have released in the past all the packet capture associated with our webcasts that we've done. This one we're not releasing yet. We'll get to that in a second, or before we close out here, but you will eventually have this available after we conduct the next webcast in the series that relies on actually the same set of packets, right? So, and they're big and I have to worry about where to host them this time as opposed to like the standard of GitHub. So with that, I want to introduce, or actually turn it over to Michael for a minute to introduce himself. He's the Endace Director of Technology Alliances. Michael, tell us a little about yourself and what does Endace do?
Yeah, thanks, Jake. So Endace is an industry leader in continuous, always-on network packet capture. So we have appliances built for any parts of the network that can continuously record network traffic to give security teams, network ops teams, the network evidence, the network forensics they need to get to the root cause of some of these really complex security issues or network performance issues. I've been in the network management space for over 25 years. I'm, as you mentioned, I lead the technology alliances for Endace. And one of our focuses is to enable you to get to the packet data in the context of many other tools and applications that you're already using. So whether it's your firewalls directly, Cisco, Palo Alto, Fortinet, whether it's your SIEMs, Splunk, IBM, QRadar, whatever, we want you to be able to get to the packet data we recorded in the context of those applications to make it as easy for you and your security teams to use the information we've captured.
Right. So the idea being basically you're not buying an appliance to capture traffic and then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you can only analyze it in our tool. Good luck with anything else.
Right.
Yeah. Despite actually having, I mean, by the way, we will see in a second here as we walk through the investigation, there are tools built in, right? We can do a lot of analysis right on the platform, but again, also the ability, you're not locked into the platform by design, right? So again, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn here.
No, you're spot on. Maybe we should make you part of my team here because you're definitely a good advertisement. No, we want you to get to the data in the context of your applications and make it as easy for you to filter through the information. So we do have Endace Vision to help sort and filter and view traffic, and we include Wireshark built into the appliance as well. So you're not moving large PCAPs around your infrastructure to troubleshoot, right? You can do it right where the data has been recorded. So we try and make it as simple as possible, but it starts with integrations with tools they're already using in their SOCs and NOCs.
Love it, absolutely. Okay, so my agenda today, I want to talk a little bit just briefly about setting the stage for third-party notifications. How do you do that? What do you do when you get that dreaded call where you do have to prove or asked to go prove the negative? We'll do some packet analysis fun, and then just wrap it up with some closing thoughts. So, I'm not going to slide read here. I'll just mention that third-party notifications suck. If you've done incident response, you know this, right? Because what happens is you're getting a call out of nowhere, and they're like, hey, so you were involved in an incident, and oftentimes you get very little other than sometimes an IP address, sometimes nothing, right? And so it's like it's almost being told, hey, go hunt badness in your network. And it's like, but we were generally already doing that kind of thing. So look, as I think about how we might be related, either we're the exploitation source, we are the command and control server, or we're a data exfiltration destination, right? Those are the three big ones that I see when somebody says, hey, you were involved, right? I'm going to have very little to work with. That's been my experience. I've done a lot of these over the years, right? And so I know how painful this is. And I can also highlight during, as we do this, how much of a difference packet capture and something Michael said earlier, and we'll come back to, is always on, not trigger based, but always on packet capture, how much of an enabler that is for me, all right? Again, I've mentioned it's no fun, just zero fun. There are no easy incidents, but these are really difficult because you probably are not getting IOCs from the third party. Largely, in many cases, they don't have them all yet. And if you do get any IOCs, they are filtering those heavily, right? I've had a couple where they've come back and been like, yeah, Jake, it's a.exe. And I'm like, that is less than useless. Like, there's nothing I can do with a.exe to, like, give me a hash value, give me anything, right? So lawyers often get in the way, right? That's just a reality. I love lawyers, listen to yours, but they do get in the way with data sharing around an incident for obvious reasons, right? Particularly when talking about two businesses, and if they already have an existing business and contractual relationship, oh my gosh, are lawyers involved, right? So how do we go about this? First off, you probably know that it is a logical fallacy to prove the negative, right? So we are never proving the negative. When you're asked to set expectations that we may not get proof, right? Obviously, the quality of your investigation is going to align with the available telemetry. What do you have? What data do you have? If you only have endpoint data, don't try to prove the negative, right? I said set expectations, right off the bat. But look, if you only have endpoint data, set the expectation that this is not something you should be doing, right? Like, I'm going to go through and look for evidence, right? We may find evidence of, but when I don't find evidence of, right, evidence that we were involved in this third-party incident, I can't tell you that just because we don't have it, doesn't mean that we weren't there, right, kind of thing, right? So this is kind of like the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, right? You get me network data and the right sensor and the right architecture, right, deployed correctly, I can look and say, oh yeah, absence of evidence, right, is indeed, in that case, evidence of absence, right? So I want to be super clear. Network data enables that. Full network data enables that. My endpoint data does not, right? Okay, so my scenario. I conveniently, what are the odds, work for the company malwarejake.com. On July 1st, we receive a notification from a third party, PPT Stack, they're a management consulting firm, that they've encountered an incident, right? And they said, hey, there was an email from you that was used, they confirmed it. And so, they must have had some control. They also said that they believe sensitive data was exfiltrated. They said there were several gigs of data, right? Gotta love these. By the way, if you haven't been through a third-party notification, this is about how it comes across, right? And if you ever do deliver a third-party notification, just get lawyers on the phone initially, because when you call up and you're like, hey, so we think you were involved in hacking us. What they hear is, we're hacking you right now, right? And so they'll get their lawyers involved. You'll have to get yours involved first anyway, right? There we go with the weird camera thing. But the threat actor, or sorry, they state the threat actors use FileZilla for exfiltration. Now, how would they know this? This is my first clue, by the way, when they say they know they use FileZilla, as opposed to giving me data about network type information. This is my first clue that we are dealing with an endpoint forensics investigation, meaning they are largely basing off of network forensics. They also mention when the intrusion occurred or when about they believe it occurred and the exfiltration occurred. So my first note here is, what is FileZilla, right? And if you're not familiar with FileZilla, for the 3 or 4 of you on here that might not be, if you've done a lot of incidents, you've seen this, right? But it's a tool that traditionally uses FTP or SFTP. And the reason I bring up the comparison chart here is because there are other things that it can synchronize to. Most of them don't apply to us, right? If they exfiltrated to Google Drive, whatever, right? That's not really a third-party notification for me, right? But WebDAV, okay, that could be me, right? So we will keep that in the back of our minds, but generally we're thinking about our standard, generally standard ports and generally standard protocols here. There's not a lot of like, what the heck is that? But just, you always want to confirm as we look at stuff here. Now, of course, the threat actor could change a port, which creates all kinds of other issues with a lot of things that are collecting metadata. I mean, I know process a particular protocol on a non-standard port, but here we have full packet data. We don't really need to worry about that, right? And so I want to introduce you quickly to the Endace probe, and I believe I'm actually in Endace Vision here. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong. Am I in Endace Vision here yet, or is it when I go into the investigation tab that I guess I am in investigation?
You are in Endace Vision. You were there.
There we go. Yeah, I thought that was the case. I couldn't remember where one ends and the other. It's so seamless. It's not like I'm opening a new app, right?
No, exactly.
Yeah. So basically here I've got I've got Endace Vision open, and what you're seeing here in this bottom tab is basically my tool mark here, and I'm going to do something that nobody ever recommends. Yep, and that's why. So I'm going to do something that nobody ever recommends. I'm going to go to a live demo, right? So let's try this. Admin password. There we go. Okay, and we've got the investigation going here. And so what you're seeing here effectively, and by the way, just to confirm, everybody is seeing Endace vision up now instead of my slides, right? Good to go. Okay. So what you're seeing here effectively is I've got a time range where I can go and set, and I'm not going to do everything that I've got in the slides. We'll go back to those for a minute here, but I do want to show how trivial it is for me to go and select a particular time and date range, and then say, show me, for instance, some piece of data here, right? So in this case, I don't want to filter just against that IP address. I want to say, okay, now show this to me. Now I want to go and apply, right? And say, well, show me all of the other traffic, right? So the stuff that I was expecting, right? And we'll get into why I was expecting all this in a few minutes, but the stuff I was expecting, now show me the everything else, right? And Endace has very quickly then processed through across top talkers. And if you're thinking like, well, why top talkers, right? Well, turns out I can do a lot of things, right? I could go in and say, well, show me a breakdown of my traffic, and I can just go add that tool in. Endace is going to go process through those gigs and gigs and gigs of traffic, and come back around and say, okay, here's what we've got. I can then select out if I'm really interested in, like basically reset the scale of my graph. And I love the fact that it just does this seamlessly, where I can get in and be like, okay, because TCP, like it makes everything else look like a rounding error, right? Well, okay, but then what else is there, right? And so anyway, I guess that's a good place there. Michael, any other tools that you want to take a look at here specifically, or?
The one I most commonly use besides the traffic breakdown top talkers is the conversation one. And that's nice because then it literally shows you directional flow between hosts, and shows you byte counts and things, obviously a number of columns there, but really useful for helping to isolate things quicker.
And by the way, too, you mentioned earlier, you've been in, around a while and done some network performance troubleshooting as well, and some of your customers do that. Is this one of these tools that you find a lot of your security teams are working with the networking teams to diagnose issues with as well, or is it just for security, or how does that play out?
No, that's a great question. Actually, historically, these groups have been very divided, right? You got the NetOps organization managing the network performance, making sure everything's up and managing all the SNMP traps and things that are associated there. The security teams typically are buying their own tools. They're trying to put things together with their firewalls, their IDSs, their endpoint things. They've got a whole slew of tools. What's sad is they don't realize they could connect this and have all the data in one location, and both tool teams could be getting to the packet data re-recorded simultaneously, right? That's part of our approach, is to help both parts of the organization.
Yep. Now that's fantastic, right? I love this, right? Because your point, right? This is something where we traditionally, and in a lot of cases, not only we've been very, very separated. In a lot of cases too, we end up, at least I find, right, that we end up in a situation where, we have bought redundant tooling, right? Where the networking team has bought some tooling that the security team could absolutely use. Security team has bought tooling, and it's like, if you just talk to each other, right, kind of thing. And I love when a tool that, again, obviously was written for, I say written for, but that facilitates a lot of network troubleshooting, also facilitates the network forensics, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what I'm showing here, by the way, you've probably seen Wireshark before. This is actually Wireshark in the probe, right? And I want to talk about the killer, like there are lots of use cases for this. I can download the PCAP, but the point here is I don't have to, right? And I love this feature. I have done a lot of work over the years with overseas organizations, right? And a lot of them have really, really poor bandwidth going out to them. And even some of my middle America, folks have poor bandwidth going out to them as well. If I've got a probe there, I do not want to download 400 megabytes of traffic or even 20 megabytes of traffic over a 256K link, only to find out it's not what I wanted, right? Those are not the droids you're looking for. Okay, for another pot of coffee, it's going to be a long night because that's 3 hours before I get my next sample back, right? This is running on the probe. And it's the tools that I need on the probe, right? So meaning on the appliance where the packets themselves are captured. And so at this point, then I can go in, right? And I can say, for instance, show me all of my, show me all of my Synax, right? So this is one of my favorite filters to go do, TCP offset 13 equals 0x12, right? And so it shows me all the Synax. It's going to go through and filter. And I can see then again, effectively like what made a successful connection. That's always why I like Synax, is because there's a lot of port scanning noise in any given publicly facing service. Here, when I do the SYNAC, now I know I'm only getting stuff that was at least successfully established, right? Now it's on me to go figure out what that is, why it is, et cetera. But again, right? Now, what I'm seeing here, of course, is I see some random high to random highs. Those could be interesting, right? Like, why do I have this random high port connecting to this other random high port, right? Well, again, like, I don't, it's not rocket science here. I just say, okay, go follow a TCP stream. Let's go take a look at that bad boy, and we'll see what traffic was sent. And again, I haven't downloaded anything from the probe. I just don't have to, right? Okay, so it turns out here that was a really, really live demos for the fail, right? I was gonna say for the win, but I just grabbed one live here and I'm like, yeah, let's look at This is where I'm gonna go back to the slides for just a minute here to redeem myself, right? And so alas, I do want to talk quickly about first pass filtering because that's what I'm gonna do before I go and start pulling traffic off of the probe. This is stuff that's intentionally not as granular, but now I am going back to my other tab here. I do want to show you my first pass filtering. I do have a lot of options, right? And they are fairly granular. They're just not as granular as we get into with, let's say Wireshark, right? So I do have a lot of options here. It's not that I'm starved for options, yeah, I got to say one of my favorite options too is application, right? And here, and if it looks like there's only a few here, right? As soon as I start typing, it's going to show like everything that matches that, right? So it's just not scrolling off the screen there. Michael, do you find that a lot of your folks are using this feature to go filter traffic?
No, absolutely. And I did a little research between our last conversation, Jake.
Yeah.
We filter over 2,000 apps. So our engineering team, obviously searches and works with the industry
yeah.
to identify, top apps and critical apps, new protocols, things like that. And so it's roughly around 2,000.
Yeah. That's fantastic, right? So I do want to throw out here one of the for me, why this matters to me, right, is that if I'm getting called into an investigation suddenly, or like, Jake, investigate, right, and I'm like, inevitably, and if you've done incident response long enough, this has happened to you too. Inevitably, they're talking about some app like it's everyone in the world knows about this application because it's big to them. They use it, right? They depend on it, and you've never even heard of it before, right? And so now I'm like, oh my gosh, what is 360 antivirus, right? And so all good. I don't have to know anything about 360 antivirus to go filter on it, right? Or whatever it happens to be, right? And that's just a game-changing feature there, at least from where I sit. So I'm going to go ahead and knock this one back here, but I wanted to talk quickly about that first pass filter because whatever I put into that first pass filter, that's what I'm ultimately going to be playing into Wireshark. It's what I'm going to be downloading. It's what's ultimately going to play across those applications or those apps that we had here, for the conversations, the traffic breakdown, top talkers. By the way, if I'm like, hey, this is taking too long to refresh, whatever, I just say, okay, good, delete the tool. It's back in 30 seconds anyway, right there from the Endace Vision user interface. So as I continue on here, where am I at? Well, I started with that IP address, right? So lest we lose the forest for the trees, right? We've got this IP address is 56.77.101.15. That's US Postal Service, in case anybody's curious. I try not to pick large, please don't go attack that IP address, right? Don't attack any IP address you don't own. But I try not to pick like large litigious organizations. And, let's be fair, right? It's the Postal Service. So if they even get around to seeing this, they'll deliver me a missed mail probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years from now, right? So anywho, so I'm going to come back to FileZilla, FTP and SFTP. So I don't have the IP address, right? But now I'm kind of like, they said FileZilla. It's not, I could stop right there and be like, no, right? There's nothing there, but I'm going to carry on because I want to be complete in my investigation. I don't want to find out they reported one IP address, but really they have, I don't know, a load balancer and maybe they've got like an AT&T and a Comcast or whatever, where there's some other IP address on my left there. So I want to go in SFTP and FTP. Again, I'm just trying to cover all my bases here, right? Now, engineering says, or DevOps says that the server isn't running FTP. It's probably got SSH, which is really SFTP in most cases, but hey, packets don't lie, right? Great, I know what engineering says, but Okay, so right around the time of the incident, right, we do have FTP, right? Now, I do want to highlight something here, and that's the That's the 9.2 megs, right? And by the way, too, this is how prophetic, by the way, that Michael's like, you know which tool I use most of the time, right? Conversations, right? But he's right. And I use conversations here for exactly that reason. It was to be able to see the byte flow, right? And to be able to see how much traffic, right, was there. And I could have seen it in the graph, which is pretty cool too. But here then I'm looking specifically at individual conversations, not the aggregate for a given IP address that may have represented lots and lots of individual connections. So I'm like, okay, well, I see some, okay. So I've got some conversations. So I want to pick that up. Now, I don't know what this is, but I know what it's not. It's not gigs of data exfil, right? In fact, 9 megs is not data exfil at all, right? I mean, okay, it could technically be a little bit of data, but it's, you know, again, sometimes I can't tell what something is, but I know immediately what it's not. I do actually want to go ahead and take a look at this because, you know, due diligence and all. And so now I am going to go ahead either and launch Wireshark with this. I could extract files. You know what? Let's do that, right? So I'm actually going to use the extract files feature here. And the extract files feature sends that traffic that I filtered over to Zeek. If you haven't used Bro or Zeek, used to be called Bro, now we call it Zeek because Bro culture is toxic, right? But if you haven't used Bro or Zeek before, basically it's a nearly magical tool that can go through and parse out lots of data from lots of applications very quickly. And one of the killer features of it is extracting files, right? And when we say file extraction, what we mean there is, let's say you download an executable, right? Or there was an executable staged on the web server. Now, remember I said one of the ways that we go about the prove the negative, right? I said you're involved in one of 3 ways. C2, right? You're a source of exploitation, or your data exfiltration destination. Those are the big 3. In fact, I would challenge to find a way that you are involved that isn't one of those, doesn't overlap with one of those 3 somehow. But okay, so that's where we're at now. What next, right? Well, as I look at this, then I'm kind of like, I do want to go and deep dive a little bit deeper because remember, FTP wasn't supposed to be running here at all, right? So that's the only reason that I'm going in further here. Otherwise, I'd be kind of back to the point of like, well, guys, that's not us, right? Like we can tell we didn't receive your gigs and gigs of data exfil even through a different IP address because we already proved by the IP they gave us. But now I'm again, because I've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, right? Where they give me one IP address, but what they really forgot was all the other IP. Michael's laughing like he's seen this before, right? Michael, you got a story on this one?
No, I've just talked to so many customers that have gone through this exact same scenario. Mm-hmm. And I love your analogies of getting the t-shirt, you win the prize, right?
Yeah, that's it, right? But seriously here, the you know, what Michael's mentioning here, this is not just me saying this, he's heard this from other customers too. Again, another great point to highlight around how great it is that Endace is like, hey, come in and teach people how to do stuff with network forensics, which is just fantastic on this because now the next time you get one of these, know that you don't stop at the IP address, right? Take that time-bounded window that they give you and the description of the activity, right? And start cutting out some. So here we're cutting out the IP address. We're focusing on the activity in that time range, right? Because again, I've been bitten on this too many times. You don't want to be. And by the way, you'll look like a superhero when you do this, right? So we kick it over to Zeek and it turns out there are no files extracted, but we have all the Zeek logs. And so I go ahead and I pull those Zeek logs down. Again, I do see lots and lots and lots of attempts to connect to the FTP service that shouldn't be running in the first place, right? There's also a weird log. And if you're not familiar with this, this is non-standard for the protocol, whatever the protocol happens to be, non-standard for the protocol. And these get loaded ultimately in whatever your Zeek or Bro configurations are. And they show a lot of stuff here. First off, it's data on SYN, right? So typically you have the 3-way handshake with TCP before you send your first data. And I say typically, the traditional model, right? Whereas today we do see a lot of data on SYN, but with FTP it's not normal. And then we also have an inappropriate FIN, right? So meaning that they didn't fully close down the connection. And this is really common in brute forcing tools, right? So, okay, right? I now have a little bit more kind of feel around this. And honestly, I could stop here, right? But I have some curiosity here. And so I go ahead and download the PCAP. Or again, you saw already, I can just jump into Wireshark inside of Endace, right? Inside of the Endace Vision. Here it's on my LAN. So, and I'm like, this is small enough. Bam, download it, go. And honestly, once I'd seen this, I was getting a copy of this PCAP anyway, because somebody's having some fun here. I don't know what those users are, but I know what they're not, right? It looks like somebody's like telling me a story or something, right? So not the droids we were looking for, but I do want to highlight again, FTP is not supposed to be running on the system. So the fact that those connections were accepted at all is itself interesting, right? So a quick look through the traffic. Again, it's not what we expected. I do need to know, how did we get there? Well, one of my questions is going to be, how long has it been there, right? And so this is a great spot where I can go turn the clock back, right? And the ability for me to go turn the clock back, and you're seeing here my traffic breakdown where I have deselected TCP, right? So just a real quick, I'll highlight that. So I've deselected TCP so that I can see this giant spike in FTP. And by the way, what is that? All right. I mean, I know what MySQL is. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply like, what is this thing, right? But why is it, right? Maybe is the better question, right? And so, well, very accurately, why is it there, right? So now I've got to get another. Now I'm keeping notes here, like other things to follow up on, right? Kind of thing. But I love the fact that I can spin back here and that I can see earlier, right? Well before the event, FTP, well before the reported event, that FTP is running. This look back feature for me is just critical when we start talking about network forensics. And Michael, I'd love to chat with you a little bit about this. Do you find customers end up using this? And if so, how?
That's one of our big differentiators. Our scale and amount of look back we can provide people is a huge asset. Not everybody wants months worth of look back, but we offer most of our customers weeks worth of look back. And that's a huge differentiator because one of the big paradigms in the industry right now, you're probably hearing a lot of solutions offering triggered capture, right? Well, trigger capture is a funny misnomer, right? It's great to get a snapshot when the athlete's coming down from the dunk, right? You missed when they took off and posterized the defender, but you missed everything that led up to it when they weaved in and out of the other four defenders, right? So in a basketball analogy, in a security analogy, I don't know how you can honestly look yourself in the eye or in the mirror and say, I'm okay with triggered capture because I don't know what happened before the trigger happened, right? It's like flying blind until you know the indicator. And the big one I always run into is a 0-day threat. If you don't know what you're triggering on, how can you be confident in triggered capture, right? And I have an example of one customer that's had us deployed. They used us for one of the big, frankly, the SolarWinds 0-day, right? So they used our packet data that we'd been recording for several weeks to go back and see how far and wide the SolarWinds traffic went. Yep. And not trying to pick on that as a specific example of 0-day. It's just one of the bigger, more recent ones. Mm-hmm. Is if you don't know what to trigger on, triggered's only so useful. Yep. And what you're getting into is you've already eliminated some things from your initial indicator. Yep. And you're now finding all these other things that you still need to check in on. And the only way you can do that is if you've had a lengthy enough look back to go back and give yourself that time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I always analogize it to my CCTV system at home, right? Don't get me wrong. I mean, I want to have like as long-term storage as I can, right? And so I do have some trigger-based capture that it saves, when there's a specific motion threshold, right? And it's like, save that. But that's not all I have. I have a look back over, several weeks, right? To be able to go back and see full. And then, in that hybrid model that I've got a little bit longer for some of the triggered. But yeah, there's no way. Even with a security camera, there's just no way that I'd be like, only record once the motion threshold, is broken, right? Because, and then that emotion is so generic. Then you get into your 0-day threat. That's where my analogy is completely broken down, right? Because,
well, and the way we're describing it now is we are both triggered and continuous because we're continuously recording. We can archive something based on the trigger anytime you want. right?
Yes.
And preserve it then for years if you want, right? It's archived off, it's saved. That's the big difference, is being able to differentiate. Do you know what happened before? And that's, so trigger with us and save it for eternity and know that you have the data before as well.
And it turns out you know how to do that with a couple of applications, like 1 or 2 or 3, something you can filter on. 2,000 something. Yeah. Anyway.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
So no, it's awesome. And that's, again, this, I know how I'm using this, but again, I come from a very forensic investigator background. And was interested to see if your customers, I'm glad to see your customers are using probably the same. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and finding how far and wide things go is right. Even if you do a triggered something off of a specific event, you're looking at very focused set of data.
Mm-hmm.
Once you start to look for lateral movement and other command and control activities, a variety of key security techniques nowadays, evasion techniques and things, the trigger kind of may or may not be there for you. I have never.
That's such a great point, right? And by the way, folks, if you can't tell, this is not scripted because I don't script stuff. But man, that is such a great point because I have never worked in intrusion with trigger-based capture where C2 has ever been included in the capture.
Okay. I figured that'd be the case, but I wasn't sure. So unlike you, I don't do the investigations day in and day out.
Yeah, no, there's no, I've never had trigger-based capture where C2 is in the capture. Rarely are the exploits there, because kind of to your point, right? Even if it's not a 0-day, right? There's signature evasion going on for anything that you would see on the network for, network intrusion detection. I don't want to say everybody's using the same rules, but everybody's using the same rules, right? And so you can start working off of, that as a threat actor to go and evade that signature. And so again, you typically don't even see the exploit, or very often don't see the exploit traffic, even in the trigger-based capture. So talked a bit about that, but I'd like to really talk about this packet replay piece. Michael, I'm going to bring you in here for a minute, if I may, just to talk about this. But I love the ability to be able to go and replay packets, right? This is a big thing for me. And the use case that I have for this, in a lot of cases, is the post-mortem, right? Stuff went boom. We didn't like that. We don't want it to happen again. I'm tuning a DLP rule or an IDS rule or something, right, for my network, basically my network sensors. And then I'm like, cool, we're good, right? If we're not good and said thing happens again, and I said we are good, that is very likely a resume updating event, or may well turn into one. And I don't want to bet my career on that, right? And so I'd much rather be able to turn around and say, okay, here's the traffic that we know, right? That we absolutely know will trigger this. It's what we're writing it off of, and then go, right? Separately, I have a horror story about screwing up a DLP rule, right? And oh, buddy, did I ever screw up a DLP rule? And I'm lucky I didn't have a resume updating event at the time. This has been almost 10 years ago now. We began flagging and blocking a lot of serious, legitimate business traffic, within the organization. If I had had the ability to go back and replay packet capture, that would not have happened, right? Because I'd have immediately known in test that my rule was so overly broad, right? Because one of the issues, obviously, is writing overly specific rules to the specific traffic, so it only ever catches that again. My rule was so overly broad, it was catching a lot of other, and it was very domain-specific traffic, meaning to their specific vertical. But again, I didn't have the ability to go back and replay. Everybody QA looked at it, like, yeah, it looks good. Catches the thing we've got. Yeah, it's good. And then we deployed it, and then boom. I mean, it was bad. It was actually, I can categorically say that the impact we caused was worse than the impact that led to us engineering the new DLP rule. Right? And that is not that's not an exaggeration by any stretch of the imagination. I love this ability to replay. Michael, I want to bring you in here again and ask, are your customers using it this way, or how else are they using it? Yeah,
they're using a variety of ways, right? Clearly, part of the reason we built that functionality is so that you could solve that exact scenario you described. And one of the other unique things about our platform is you mentioned Zeek, right? We can host third-party tools right on our product. So Zeek can run. We in our OSM release, we actually bundle Zeek, Suricata, a number of tools right onto the appliance. And so being able to then replay a set of data, whether that's a day's worth of data, a few days worth of data, maybe even a whole week, and say, in that period of time, I want to rerun it through my system to see if that signature is there. In your case, you described a specific rule set. Is it filtering the right things? That is a game changer for people to really figure out, do they have things set up and are they filtering the way, right? The nuances, as you described, in putting a new policy or rule in place and specific various traffic filters, it's incredibly complex, right? Anybody who works with packet data, network traffic, routing, switching, knows the complexity of that. And so being able to have a replay capability and make sure your policy is true to what you're shooting for, can save tons of headache later, right? So the time savings alone, and again, I mentioned kind of the broad use case of the 0 day. Well, so all right, you get a update to today or tomorrow of the latest CVE. You update all your firewalls and your IPSs, IDSs, your policy engines. You deploy that network wide. Well, wouldn't it be nice if you could, have your Palo Alto, have your Cisco running on the Endace probe, which you can install the VM series of right on the probe, run it through and say, is that signature now matched in the last week's worth of traffic?
And that's what I'm showing here is I don't have a bunch of virtual machines running on this, but what I'm showing here on the screen here is the ability, like you do actually have the ability to go and load and run virtual machines directly from the probe. And again, sometimes I run into these features where I'm like, who asked for this, right? Kind of thing. But this is obvious to me, right? And again, if you are in the haves, right? I'm going to call you in the haves, where you have amazing network bandwidth everywhere, right? It's particularly on the WAN side, and you can go to a remote site and you're just like, it's just like you're sitting there. Then game on. This feature I still think is useful, but it may be less useful for you. But I'm going to tell you for the have-nots, right? The everybody else, right? This again can turn an investigation wall time, right? You can take wall time to equal investigative time versus the dealing with waiting to drag traffic back home to do the analysis, right? We have had stuff where, like, I remember doing an investigation 2 years ago. I mean, not the first time I've done this; it won't be the last. Where we FedExed out, like overnight FedEx out to foreign countries, 3 different laptops. To put them on site, right? Next, Michael's like, yep, been there, right? So that I could, basically so that I could like team viewer into those, right? Or go to my PC or whatever we use at the time, into those machines so that I could access it as if it were on the LAN, right? Now, granted, I still have the UI, lag there, right? But I'm not waiting, days to pull traffic back across and do that analysis. The fact that it was more cost effective and time effective, not just cost effective from like analyst time, but like it was going to take longer to get the packets back than it took FedEx to physically get a laptop onto site and installed, right?
Right.
That's where you start getting into like, oh my gosh, like this is game-changing killer feature stuff, right?
Yeah.
So.
And we can host a comment on that, Jake. We can host up to, on our largest box, it obviously varies based on appliance, but on our largest box, we can host up to 12 VMs. So you can have 12 instances of Zeek, or a couple of Zeek and a couple of Palo Alto VM series or Cisco Firepower, whatever it may be, Fortinet. Being able to run those right in there, and depending on what your vendor of choice is, we're open to that approach, and being able to have those tools analyzing the traffic and inspecting the traffic while we're continuously recording is a huge differentiator.
Oh yeah, and I should probably note here, by the way, I've got a little baby appliance, right? So I've got the starter model because I don't need anything more, right? Is what it comes down to. But yeah, on the big models, like obviously, if you're looking, you're like, that doesn't look like a lot of disk, right? Well, again, I've got the baby model, right? So,
well, even your baby model, I think, can do 4 VMs, so I'm not sure. I'm
sure. No, I didn't mean to imply that it was small, but if
no, I know what you mean. But it's designed to where you want to put it in the network and the size of the location, right? Branch offices, a small remote office, you don't need a big box to record what traffic you've got, right? So
exactly. So okay, carrying on with our investigation here, right? So we're looking backwards. We discover a spike in traffic way, way earlier, and again, so FTP, we can conclude now, and I want to be super clear about this. This makes it easy for me to turn and say, okay, look, we know we had a problem before their reported intrusion, right? Now, that doesn't support or refute, that fact alone doesn't support or refute that we were or were not involved, but it's still a data point. I am going to go ahead and do another file extraction though, based on this, because I'm like, okay. And now, okay, FTP, I do not know what database.mdf is, but we're going to go find out, right? And so what are we doing now? Well, I'm going to go and pull this into basically into Wireshark. Now, in this particular case, I downloaded the PCAP because I'm ultimately maybe going to want a copy of that file. And it just makes it easier for me to do that local in Wireshark than in, than inside the probe. But again, I'm doing that because I have the luxury of being on the LAN. And the beauty of me not having to do that again is just game changing. So now you'll note here, I started with a filter of the IP address of interest, right, that we saw in the Zeek logs. Now this is FTP data, right? You'll notice here a random high port to a random high port, right? So this is basically the FTP data connection. I don't want to follow that TCP stream if I want to see like what did they log in as. But if I want the file contents, right? Even if I don't have, because remember, I don't recognize that file. And if that file is not on the disk, now I'm in like this double problem of like, oh, hey, there's some metadata that shows like if I only have, let's say I only have Zeek running on the network. And they're like, yeah, it's this file, database.mdf. It was downloaded by this guy. We know how big it is. We don't know what it is, right? You turn left and right, the file's not there. Nobody knows what it was. Right? I can extract it here from packet capture, right? And again, this is the kind of thing you typically won't see in a trigger-based connection, right? Okay, trigger-based network collection. So I'm basically looking for what's the connection on port 21 before this traffic, sorted linearly, right? Or sorted by time. That's what we're kind of looking at over a relative start to the packet capture. And so now that I know that, I go in and I follow TCP stream and okay, we have a lot of problems now, right? We have a problem of, by the way, this, just for those that aren't familiar, this is port command. This ultimately tells you what the port is that's going to be, ultimately the port is that's going to be used, right? So what TCP port's going to be used, and they break it into, ultimately break it into, what is that, two 8-bit numbers, because the port's a 16-bit number, right? But we also know that there's a ridiculously bad password here. So I don't know yet, is this something the threat actor did? Is something the IT team did? I certainly am concerned, right? Now I'm like on the spot of, we had a little data exfil. What other data exfil did we have? Well, this is yet another spot where I'm not going to packet capture. I'm looking at top talkers right inside of Vision, right? Right inside of Endace Vision. So again, I know what, I kind of know where we're at here. I don't have just overall a complete, like forgetting about SSH, SFTP, FTP, et cetera. What I'm looking at now is just my top talkers, because remember, several gigs were involved. And this 134 guy over here, this is our server. This is the malwarejake.com server. And so I'm going to go ahead and filter that out, likely, in some of, I say filter it out, meaning at least filter away from that, because what I'm looking at here is I don't want it necessarily to always skew my graphs, but remember MySQL was publicly exposed, right? That's interesting. Now we don't have a lot of traffic around that. Obviously the stuff in your databases could be considered really, really sensitive, right? Now this could have been traffic inside the VPC, right? We need to know where our sensor is placed relative to, relative to capture. But this traffic is insufficient to be data exfil. It may even just be port scans, right? But how do we know? Well, again, I can quickly pivot over to Wireshark. And you see me here using basically I'm taking that IP address that we saw on our top talkers, right? This is our second top talker, right? And by the way, I could filter all that in the first pass as opposed to putting into Wireshark. I just figured it'd be easier to, given this relatively small amount total of traffic, it'd be easier to filter in Wireshark later and include it all. But I quickly here then filter against that IP address. I do that little trick about the 0x12 that's our SYNAC, and we see then 179 successful connections. So a couple of things to deduce here, right? One, these are probably not successful logins at this stage, right? Because there's 179 of them and a couple of megabytes. Two, MySQL is running and exposed to the internet and accepting connections, right? Like that, we see it there, like the packets don't lie, we're set. This is problematic, right? Okay, so what happened to our server, right? Look, when our org was accused of involvement in an incident and we find evidence of compromise, it is very common that folks fall victim to what we call the illusory correlation, right? And this happens all the time in security. Don't do this. If you have an unkept garden and you have a gardener that shows up and starts turning over rocks for the first time, they're gonna find snakes. That's not because the gardener brought the snakes, it's because nobody was looking. The third-party notification made you go look. Lots and lots of networks have threat actors in them, right? And that's just part of the reality. So anyway, I just want to make sure to clarify here, there are two separate threads going. We are trying to prove that we were not involved in the PPT stack incident, and separately, we definitely have an incident, right? Now, if you want to argue it's not yet a security incident or we don't know for sure it's not, I'm probably tipped a little bit over that ledge already, but okay, let's carry on, right? It could just be misconfigurations, and whether you call a security misconfiguration incident before it's exploited, meh, that's up to you, right? So let's go turn to the unknown. We know about MySQL. We expect port 80, our web traffic, right? Now there's a load balancer up front that does the TLS break inspect for us on for publicly exposed there. So we're seeing it in the decrypted as is very, very common. But I'm filtering out everything that I know about, and then I'm saying what's left, right? So what is left? Well, I have an interesting guy over here, this 24 host, right? And I do a filter to get rid of him. Again, this is another place where first pass filtering is just fantastic. I definitely want to look at him, but I also want to look at everybody else without him there, right? And you can see how that completely changes the scale over there on the left, from gigs to megs, right? And so, okay, so what next, right? What do I want to look at next? Well, and by the way, too, if I uncheck the box for the 134, the scale gets even easier to read, right? But I didn't do that in my screenshots, bad me. But let's take a look at conversations, right? So I'm going to go filter on a couple of these. This one on port 8000 sure does look interesting. We shouldn't have anything running there. And okay, well, that looks like HTTP, right? Now we have database.zip. We had database.mdf earlier, database.zip. And what is database.zip, right? Well, I do want to go take a look at that. And again, remember, nothing's supposed to be running on port 8000. That itself is weird, right? Well, okay. Now I go in and take a look at TC. Right? We know what's going on here, right? This is Python's simple HTTP server, right? It even says so, right? You don't have to have much knowledge there to know this isn't Apache, right? We're running Apache on port 80. This is not our stuff. Somebody else started this. That's bad. That's all kinds of bad. That means someone has code execution permissions on our system, right? I want to make sure we're all clear about this, right? Somebody now is executing code on our system, right? Okay, so we check a different IP address, right? And so if you're like, how'd you get there, right? Remember, this is my everything else packet capture, right? So there's a bunch of, right? I've got it. I mean, you can see one, goodness, there's a couple of these that show up again and again and again. This 134 guy, remember, that's us, right? That's our server. We see a couple of these that show up again and again and again, right? And those look fun, right? But taking a look further here, right, and see, okay, right? So we get more bad news here, right? So this is a shell. Like, there's no question this is a shell. That's not ideal, right? I would prefer if, threat actors weren't launching shells on my system, right? Michael, have you seen this in the wild before?
Well, you definitely don't want shells running on any server from an outside source. I mean, that's just foundational basics.
No, I mean, sure. But what I was asking is, like, have you seen this before where, one of your clients has been able to go back and not only see that there was a shell there, but then actually go back through and reconstruct threat actor activity? Yeah,
we had one example with a customer that they actually, it was an embedded shell. It was actually tied to the Olympics in Korea.
Yeah,
where there was it was a document from like Korean Olympic people, and then embedded in it was a shell script inside the graphical image, and it had people update the graphics. It was a very complex situation, but that was a scenario that hit very much like this.
Yep. And then, but with packet capture, there you have the ability to see that whole attack chain, right?
Yeah.
Again, providing now, look, folks, we know TLS is a thing, right? We're not waving hands around that. But a lot of folks have TLS break inspect, and you obviously put your packet capture behind TLS break inspect, right?
Right.
But yeah, so this is again, being able to see this and reconstruct what did they do is just, game changing, right? And we can see it here. Right? We filter on another IP address, right? And I hate to use the words more shells than a sandy beach, but that's where we're at, right? And by the way, we've only scratched the surface on shells. This thing was ridden hard, like multiple different threat actors targeting here. In fact, this shell is a little bit different. And if you're curious about what is the red, blue, whatever thing going on here, right? Why is that echoing? What you're seeing effectively here is they have actually opened a TTY, right? And so it's echoing everything that they type back to them, right? Just like you would do with old traditional telnet, right? Now, of course, when it sends something back, right, it's only being echoed back from the server, right? So blue is coming from the client, red is coming from the server, but that red is it being echoed back in a TTY. Well, they did that, I think. I don't obviously can't get inside the head of the threat actor, and this is not me, by the way. Like people actually targeted this, but Malware Jake is me, right? And so is the server. The server belongs to me, but these are not my actions. But here, I suspect they started a TTY specifically so they could go in and do interactive, let's say in the MySQL shell or the MySQL shell, right? So if you want to do stuff like that, you have to have a TTY. Right? You can't do that off just like a standard netcat backdoor, or pipe bash to basically or tie bash to a network port in Python or what have you. So, man, this hour has flown by, or the first 50 minutes of it sure have. What are my conclusions? Right? Look, first off, our server was definitely compromised by unknown threat actors. MySQL and FTP were not supposed to be exposed to the internet, but they are. Our DevOps team says that FTP shouldn't be running in the first place, right? There is no record, however, of communication to or from the third-party IP address. Not only that, the quantity of data the third-party claims is exfiltrated, and we now are pretty confident their claims are based solely on endpoint data, right? Because I'm going to tell you that if we go back to them, when we go back to them and say, hey, we can't support your conclusions, they're like, you're wrong. I'm going to be like, show me the packets. Right? Because I can show you the packets, you show me the packets, right? So again, it could not have come past our network collection sensor. And I'm going to presume, because we actually are doing this, right, that we've thought about our sensor placement and we're very methodical about that. And so that's equivalent to saying it didn't happen, right? So our verdict is the third party made assumptions based on endpoint data and a lack of network data, whereas our network data proves authoritatively their version of events did not occur. So what are our next steps here? We obviously have unresolved incident. We have an investigation to conduct, so we understand the intrusion on our server. Conveniently, that's the next Endace webcast, right? That we're going to be doing off of the same packet data, and we're going to walk through using again Endace Vision. We're going to walk through how to marry up what you're seeing in the Apache logs on the endpoint side to what you're actually seeing in packet capture, and show that if you only have endpoint logs, you're missing a lot of stuff and you're not able to say conclusively how particular exploits occurred. And certainly there were many of them. I mean, you already saw several shells. We'll get into how those shells actually respond, because you'll be able to see that in the packet capture data, and conveniently, or well, maybe not conveniently, it's not convenient at all, but not in the endpoint logs, right? And so we're going to show you how you're going to put together a better, and by the way, if you've got any endpoint folks out there that are like getting ready to send me hate mail, please don't, right? Like it takes a village, right? There is no one forensic discipline that does it all. We used to give a talk at SANS, have no fear, DFIR is here, right? Me and Rob Lee and Heather Mahalik and Phil Hagen, right? We get up and talk about how, Lenny Zeltzer, each different piece of forensics, right, is pointing basically shining a lens. And as we put all that data together, we're better for it, right? The point I want you to take away from here today is I have a lot of folks today that are like, Jake, endpoint is where it's at. It's all endpoint. I'm like, it's not all endpoint, right? Like endpoint's important, but it's not the end, right? So again, you're going to tell stories nothing else can, right? I'm going to throw the closing thought slide up here. This isn't anything you haven't heard me say already. I'm going to hand the mic back to Michael. No pun intended here. Michael, wrap us up here, man. You got like 3-4 minutes. I don't have any questions if anyone wants to drop one of those. And otherwise, give us a war story, give us some thoughts here.
Well, no, this is I didn't know until we talked earlier, right? The use case you were going through. And ironically, this is a real world scenario that we had with it was a healthcare provider. Now I won't go into the details of who they were or what they found or didn't find, but they had an indicator of compromise. They used our packet data to determine, again, it was ultimately a false positive. Now they did have some issues, just like the exact same scenarios you found, but they were able to contain to exactly what systems those issues were tied to, and that they were also to validate that there was absolutely no data exfiltrated. So those two things alone in their situation enabled them to avoid thousands of dollars of compliance reporting, right? This is a healthcare provider. So by being able to prove the negative, which your title of this section was, they basically avoided lots of paperwork, lots of public humiliation. I'm not saying it would have been humiliating because there was nothing done, but just the reporting, right? And the potential brand damage by proving the negative, right? Proving that nothing was actually exfiltrated, no PI data was taken, no sensitive data was taken, no servers of concern were even touched, right? In their case. So being able to prove the negative sometimes can be way more cost saving and important than not, right?
Oh yeah. And you mentioned thousands. I mean, if you saw me go like that, it wasn't that I was thinking you're like thousands or tens of thousands or whatever. People hear about a $50,000 fine assessed against somebody, like, man, $50,000, way to hurt them. And it's like, that $50,000 didn't matter at all. They spent $1 million writing the paperwork up for that 50 grand. And that is not an exaggeration in most cases, right?
No,
so the fine almost doesn't matter compared to, as you pointed out, brand damage and the amount of time. People don't understand too, like when you have to stand up a call center, right? And the number of people that call just because they don't know, right? They got the confusing letter and it is like you're paying for all of that. It is a tremendous cost. Being able to turn around and be like, no, and not just no because I think so, no because I'm 100% sure because I have the data to show it, right? Because typically in my experience with these, and I love that you had a scenario like, I don't love that one of your customers had the scenario, but I love that we were able to pivot off of that because in my experience, man, it's the people coming to me don't have data. They've got like one anecdote, right? Well, it must have been you because, right? Or you must be involved because. And if I've got the data to show it, it's like, hey, man, my data trumps your assumption, right? So anyway, any other closing thoughts?
You nailed it. Turning up the identity verification you got to offer, and all those other costs are really where the savings was, right? The fine, you're right.
Yeah.
But we're talking in the millions for everything else.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, hey, I guess that takes us to the top of the hour. And folks, thanks so much for tuning in. Obviously, a copy of the webcast is going to be available here. The recording, the slides will also be available. Reach out to Endace and talk to them. They, again, fantastic product line. And I seriously have one of them like 10, 15 feet from where I'm sitting. Again, it's a fantastic product. Absolutely love it. And you can see how you can use it to ultimately do network forensic investigations. I want to thank them for bringing this content to the SANS community. And in August, we will be running the next in our series. I think it's August. I'll be running the next, or even late July, one of those. The next in our series where we go in and investigate the rest of the intrusion. And at that point, we'll release endpoint logs and packets. With that, folks, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it back to Carol. Michael, thank you so much for joining me. Carol,
thank you, Jake.
Thank you so much, Jake and Michael, for your great presentation, and to Endace for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.